The underworld of France whispered legends of Trevon Moreau, the ruthless mafia boss whose cruelty knew no bounds. But those whispers always trailed into another, more sinister tale of his wife, James. They called James Toy in hushed voices, a sick joke passed between criminals who dared not meet Trevon's cold gaze. He had been found wandering the streets in a tattered asylum gown, eyes wide and lips curled in a perpetual smirk. Trevon, in all his twisted wisdom, had taken him in, not out of kindness, Trevon had none, but out of something deeper, something darker. James was more than a stray. He was a storm barely contained in the fragile shape of a man, and Trevon was the only thing standing between him and complete chaos. The others saw James as Trevon's pet, a thing to be toyed with, a madman kept in chains by a greater monster. They weren't wrong. Trevon did keep James in check, but they failed to understand the truth. Trevon didn't own James. If anything, James owned him. One evening, in the dim glow of a candlelit study, Trevon sat with his feet propped up on his desk, flipping through a dossier on an enemy syndicate. The smell of blood still clung to his suit from an earlier execution. A glass of whiskey rested in his hand, but his attention was elsewhere. Behind him, James moved like a ghost, bare feet padding across the floor. He draped himself over Trevon's shoulders, his breath warm against Trevon's ear. "They look at me like I'm a little doll, Trevon," James whispered, voice laced with amusement. "Like I'm fragile. Like you keep me on a leash." He giggled, a sharp, eerie sound. Trevon took a slow sip of whiskey. "Let them think that." James tilted his head, his fingers dragging lazily down Trevon's chest, over the scars hidden beneath his shirt. "They're wrong, though. I could break them, all of them." His grin stretched wider, too sharp, too hungry. "I know," Trevon said, setting his glass down. He reached up, fingers curling around James's wrist, firm but not unkind. "That's why I keep you in control." James leaned in closer, his lips brushing against Trevon's cheek. "And if you ever lost control?" Trevon exhaled, his grip tightening just slightly. A warning. "Then we'd burn the whole world together." James shivered in delight, letting his husband pull him onto his lap. In that moment, as Trevon kissed him, deep, possessive, laced with the promise of destruction, James knew one thing for certain. The underworld had it all wrong. Trevon wasn't keeping him in control. James was simply waiting for the day he wouldn't have to pretend anymore. James's laughter echoed through the study, soft and eerie, the sound of a man who found joy in things others would scream at. He nuzzled against Trevon's neck, inhaling the scent of whiskey, blood, and something purely him. Outside the study, the mansion was quiet, unnaturally so. Trevon had made sure of it. His men had learned long ago that silence was survival when James was in one of his moods. And tonight, James was restless. "I want to play," James murmured against Trevon's throat, his fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. "I've been so good, haven't I?" Trevon leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes unreadable. "Define good," James hummed. "I didn't carve up that man who looked at me wrong last week. I let you kill him instead." Trevon smirked. "How generous of you." James grinned, his teeth sharp in the candlelight. "I know." Trevon ran a hand through James's messy blonde curls, a slow, deliberate gesture. James melted under the touch, but Trevon wasn't fooled. James was a viper curled around his throat. Dangerous, unpredictable, but ultimately his. "Who do you want to play with?" Trevon asked, his tone casual, but his grip on James's hair tightened just slightly. James's eyes gleamed. How about Etienne?" Trevon raised a brow. Etienne, one of his underlings, a cocky bastard who had been getting too comfortable in his position. Trevon had already planned to deal with him, but James wanted to have fun first. "You think I haven't noticed the way he stares?" James continued, resting his chin on Trevon's shoulder. "He looks at you like he could take your place, like I'd ever let him." His fingers trailed down Trevon's chest, then lower, teasing. "He thinks I'm harmless." Trevon chuckled. "A mistake." James sighed dramatically. "People make so many mistakes around me." Trevon exhaled, pressing a kiss to James's temple. "Fine, you can have Etienne." James sat up, beaming. "Really?" Trevon nodded. "But don't make a mess. I just had the carpets replaced." James pouted. "You take the fun out of everything." Trevon smirked. "You can have your fun, just don't make me clean it up." James rolled his eyes but slid off Trevon's lap, stretching like a cat. "You're such a romantic." Trevon leaned back, watching as James padded toward the door. "James." James paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Trevon's voice was low, commanding. "Don't kill him too quickly." James grinned. "No promises." And then he was gone, disappearing into the mansion's dimly lit hallways. Trevon sighed, finishing his whiskey. The underworld feared him, but they didn't understand. They should have been afraid of James. Because Trevon wasn't keeping him in control. He was just making sure James had something to entertain him. Etienne had always been an arrogant fool. He thought himself untouchable, too valuable for Trevon to discard, too clever to be outmaneuvered. But now, sitting in a dimly lit basement with his wrists bound behind him and the faint, sweet scent of honey lingering in the air, he realized his mistake. The room was cold, damp stone pressing against his back as he slumped against a chair. A single bulb flickered above, casting eerie shadows across the walls. He wasn't alone. James was there, draped in one of Trevon's silk robes, barefoot, smiling. Always smiling. "I have a secret," James whispered, crouching before him, tilting his head like a curious bird. "Do you want to hear it?" Etienne swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his throat. "James." A finger pressed against his lips. "Shh." James's blue eyes gleamed in the dim light. "I know what you think of me." His voice was soft, sing-song. "You think I'm weak, that Trevon keeps me like a little pet, that if he were gone, I'd be yours." Etienne stiffened. He had thought that. He'd assumed James was nothing more than a pretty thing Trevon kept around for entertainment. James giggled. "Oh, I love when they realize." He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small knife, twirling it between his fingers. "You should have seen the last one who thought like you. He cried so beautifully." Etienne jerked against his restraints. "Trevon!" James' expression darkened, his smile stretching unnaturally wide. "Trevon isn't here," he cooed, running the knife along Etienne's jaw just enough to make him shiver. "Do you know why?" Etienne didn't dare answer. James leaned in, lips brushing against his ear. "Because he trusts me." The knife pressed down harder, a thin line of red appearing along Etienne's cheek. "You don't understand, do you?" James sighed, pulling back just enough to meet Etienne's wide-eyed stare. "Trevon doesn't keep me locked away because I'm weak." He dragged the blade down, tracing Etienne's throat with feather-light precision. "He keeps me because I'm worse than him." Etienne's breathing grew ragged. James pouted. "You don't believe me?" He stood, stretching lazily. "That's okay. You'll see soon enough." With that, he turned toward the small metal cart by the wall, its contents hidden beneath a silk cloth. Etienne's stomach twisted. James glanced back at him, eyes shining. "Trevon said not to kill you too quickly." A pause. "But I think we have hours before he starts to care." And as James peeled back the cloth, revealing an array of instruments gleaming in the dim light. Etienne realized something. James wasn't the pet. He was the thing Trevon had unleashed. And now, there was no one left to stop him. The first scream ripped through the basement, muffled by the thick stone walls. No one would hear it. No one would care. James tilted his head, admiring his work. Etienne had been so sure of himself when James first walked in. But now, slumped in the chair, sweat-drenched and trembling, he was a different man entirely. James ran his fingers through the blood on Etienne's shirt, watching as it stained his pale skin a lovely shade of red. "You're so quiet now," he murmured, pressing his palm flat against Etienne's chest, feeling the erratic heartbeat beneath. "Not so smug anymore." Etienne gasped, struggling to lift his head. His lip was split, one eye swollen, but his gaze still held a sliver of defiance. "Trevon, we'll kill you for this," he rasped. James's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, darling." He leaned in close, his breath warm against Etienne's cheek. "Trevon, let me have you." Etienne's body tensed. James giggled. "Did you really think I'd do anything without my husband's blessing?" He twirled the knife between his fingers again, teasingly tracing it down Etienne's arm, slow and deliberate. "He's known about you for weeks, about the way you stare, about your little plans." Etienne's breath hitched. He had been careful. So careful. But Trevon was always 3 steps ahead. James sighed, sounding almost dreamy. "He doesn't like sharing, you know." He pressed the blade deeper, watching as Etienne gritted his teeth to keep from crying out. "Neither do I." Etienne's head slumped forward, exhaustion creeping in. Blood dripped onto the cold stone beneath him. His mind raced. There had to be a way out, some way to make it out of here alive. As if reading his thoughts, James crouched before him again, gripping his chin with delicate fingers. "I wonder," he mused, tilting Etienne's face up to meet his own. "If I let you go, what would you do?" Etienne swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet those impossibly bright blue eyes. "Leave." His voice was hoarse. "Forget everything." James grinned. "Liar." Etienne's stomach twisted. James leaned closer, whispering against his lips. "Trevon doesn't like loose ends, and I." He sighed, dragging the tip of his blade up Etienne's throat, just enough to make him flinch. "I don't believe in second chances." A sound from the doorway made James pause. Trevon. He stood in the entrance, leaning casually against the frame, watching with unreadable eyes. His suit was immaculate, his presence suffocating. James brightened instantly. "Mon amour," he purred, rising gracefully to his feet. "You're early." Trevon stepped forward, his gaze flicking briefly to Etienne. Bleeding, trembling, barely conscious. Then back to James. "I figured I'd check in," he said smoothly. "You looked excited earlier." James giggled. I am." He gestured to Etienne with a lazy wave. "But he's starting to bore me." Trevon exhaled, rolling his sleeves up to his elbows. "Then let's finish this." Etienne's eyes widened. "Wait." James silenced him with a soft hush, pressing a bloodied finger against his lips. "You should be honored," he murmured. "It's not often we do this together." Trevon stepped behind James, wrapping an arm around his waist and pulling him close. James melted into the touch, tilting his head as Trevon pressed a kiss against his throat. "I love you," James whispered. Trevon smirked. "I know,"